Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Before we start today's segment, I do want to give a warning to our viewers that we will be discussing a police shooting incident, and I know that our viewers have seen a lot of that this week, so discretion is advised. In August of 2014, a Phoenix police sergeant showed up at the apartment of a 50-year-old Michelle Cusseau. Now, he had been sent to pick her up on a court-ordered transfer to a psychiatric facility. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and depression. And she came to the door. Mind you, she is 5'5", 130 pounds, 50 years old, holding a small hammer. And the responding officer responded by firing a single round into Michelle Cusseau's chest and killing her. Now, her death triggered demands in Phoenix for a deeper review of how the police department handles mental health calls and for alternative resources outside of law enforcement. But change, as it always is, proved to move slowly. Phoenix cops continued to kill people, with police shootings reaching record levels in 2018, and many advocates expressing continued concern that when police were killing people, they were often people who needed help in a crisis. And now it's been nearly 7 years after Cusseau's tragic death, and it appears that Phoenix may finally be prepared to take real steps to explore alternatives to policing, particularly when it comes to mental health issues. Last month, the City Council discussed a plan to invest an additional $15 million over the next 3 years into a community assistance program that would be housed within the city's fire department. And the funding would pay for 19 vans with more than 130 civilian crisis interventionists. And those interventionists would be dedicated to responding to 911 calls involving issues of homelessness, substance use, mental health, or behavioral health issues. And Phoenix is just one jurisdiction that is part of this larger movement throughout the country to divert resources away from law enforcement and to put those resources into agencies and entities and organizations that are better equipped to handle those issues. It's a recognition of the fact that so many issues do not need a badge and a gun. And that is particularly true when it comes to mental health issues, but it also applies to other issues like traffic stops. And when it comes to mental health issues, we know that about 1/4 of all people who are killed by police are experiencing problems related to mental illness. And often police officers just come and they make matters worse, not better. But even in the best case scenario, where cops may not necessarily harm a person in the process, at least not physically, a law enforcement interaction is more likely to lead to arrest and incarceration and the complete explosion of somebody's life based on the cycle of incarceration. And so by creating a new system where the best people are actually being deployed to respond to mental health calls, officials are saying that they could ensure better outcomes for people who are in crisis, while also freeing up officers to concentrate on crimes and legitimate public safety issues. So joining me now to talk about Phoenix's plan to launch this new alternative to police for mental health responses is City Council member Carlos Garcia. Thank you so much for being here, Council member.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why don't you start by giving us a view from the ground on why it is that Phoenix needs a new response to mental health calls. I mean, I mentioned the case of Michelle Cusseau at the top, but what has the broader pattern of armed police response to mental and other behavioral health crises looked like in Phoenix over the years?
I want to thank you for, starting off the show speaking about Michelle. And last week, as we were having the budget hearings, Lorenza called, who's the mother of Paco, who was murdered in 2018. And forever, she will have to hold her live son in her own hands because she called for some mental health assistance. And the officers that showed up to her trailer home shot him in the back 6 times. Not only did they shoot him in the back 6 times, but they had asked her to step outside of her trailer before they murdered him. And she heard the gunshots, and then they took her to a different location, held her for 8 hours, then came back and dropped her off in her home without having told her son was dead. And with the police department having already done a press conference telling the rest of the world that he was dead, they dropped her off right back in her trailer, where her son's blood was still fresh in their living room. And I bring that story up, just like Michelle's, to say that it is a crisis. It is a crisis all over the country. But in Phoenix, unfortunately, we have not gotten the attention that other jurisdictions have gotten. In 2018, we were the deadliest police force in the country, and cases like Michelle and Paco's have happened throughout the years. I've joined the council a year and a half ago, and the lack of the council's ability to take on this issue was one of the impetus for me running for office. Now, I think for Michelle and for Paco, this crisis response network, or CAP program, comes a little too late. But I think it's important to center those stories and center the things that could have been or should have been done differently as we move forward with this process.
Thank you for sharing that story. Can you give us a status update on where these conversations about this new alternative stand right now? How is the City Council proceeding with plans to invest in expanding the community assistance program?
So we are excited that the initial budget has a $15 million allocation. I think it's a, excuse me, it's a worthwhile investment, and it's a serious investment. I think other programs in other cities have started with smaller programs. So I'm excited that we're looking into spending $15 million to begin this process. Now, we've already had a volunteer program that's been around for a while. It answers to about 4,000 calls a year, but we have around 25 to 30,000 calls every year that have just police showing up to it. Where the process is at, we will vote and finalize our budget in May. After that, we will move to writing the ordinance, creating the program, hiring the folks, and going into implementation. One thing I want to do, Mark, is as a council and as a city of Phoenix, we've failed in the past, is to actually have community involvement in this, in the process of creating these types of programs. So one of the things we're going to make sure that we're fighting for is that those that are most impacted, even the family members of folks that have been murdered by the police, be involved in the creation of this new program.
You know, I have to ask, as somebody who works in government and as somebody who has been seeing the trauma that has been inflicted on Black and Brown communities for so long, how is it that when we have seen so much police brutality, you know, I started out the show talking about 2014, talking about Michelle Clouseau, which happened briefly following Michael Brown, and you talking about Paco Valdez. And how is it that you, as an elected official, are able to continue to push for change and be optimistic about change when we've seen, I mean, here we are 7 years after and still dealing with the same thing?
I don't know if optimism is the right word. I think it continues to be tough, as we talk about Michelle and Paco right now and others. And the video came out of the 13-year-old in Chicago this morning. We had a 14-year-old, my son's 14. We had a 14-year-old Arce, who was murdered by Tempe police, our neighboring police department, last year. And I happened to walk alongside that family and support them in their grief and trying to find justice. I also can't look at the next family and tell them that we didn't try something, whether it's an Office of Accountability and Transparency, whether we're trying to shift the Memorandum of Understanding, or any part of the system that's allowed police officers to murder with impunity here in Phoenix. And so, I don't know, again, optimism might not be the right word, because we cannot guarantee that more people will not die at the hands of police. But what we can do is try to have impact and reduce those harms. And I think until we start a real conversation of changing the culture and the values and what we fund. Defunding the police is a scary word right now for many folks. But that's the conversation we need to have. We need to allocate resources and understand that our budgets are moral documents. And until we start defunding, until we start holding these officers accountable, nothing's going to change. And those stories we were told today are going to continue in the future. And so there is optimism in the people in the streets. There's optimism in in the willingness to try things. I think now what we need is elected officials and elected bodies to be able to take the risk necessary to shift this culture. We just had a really tough week again with what's happened in Minnesota, what's coming out of the Chicago this morning. We can no longer just keep talking about, I've said Black Lives Matter in the past, just saying it isn't enough. Getting into these budgets and figuring out new programs and new ways to do things is what we need to make happen.
And you talk a lot about, so let's have that conversation, because you're saying that on one hand, it's important to invest in certain programs, but on the other hand, it is important to defund police and at the same time, or whatever you want to call it, defund police, but at the same time also change the culture of that department. So what does that look like? And specifically, I know there are some things that communities have made demands about how they wanted it to look. So having a separate unit outside of fire and police department, no cooperation with ICE, no weapons of any kind, no pepper spray, no tasers. So what is your take on those demands, and also on how do we do those two things, change the culture and also invest in all of the programs that we need to invest in?
Yeah, I mean, these $15 million are great, and I think my colleagues are going to be willing to vote for it. I mean, we still have to fight and make this happen because it's important, but the money's not coming from the police department. The money's coming from our general budget. And this is money that could be used for parks. This is money that could be used for other social services or services of the city. And so again, I'm excited we're moving forward with this, but I think there is importance if we're taking work away from the police department, which we all at this point at least are acknowledging armed officers should not be handling mental health crises. If we're taking that work away, we should also take the funding. And again, I think it goes to the culture, the untouchable culture that police unions have created to allow them to function with impunity is what we need to handle. We just signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the police union that does take away some of those protections that they've had in the past. And I think we need to continue to chip away at that to make sure we are holding folks accountable. And so some of the other things you mentioned, yes, the fire department right now ideally will be a holding place. I know the city of Oakland just started their program, and they're going to be hosting it within the fire department. A place like a public health department, which at the city of Phoenix, unfortunately, we don't have, and it's another thing we're trying to move on this year, is a better place for programs like these to function. And so we can't give a timeline of when this newly formed department will be on its own or will be in a more adequate space. But for now, at least for the development of the program, it will be living inside the fire department.
So tell me a little bit about the place that trauma-informed care has in this discussion, because I know that's something you've talked about before. So talk to us a little bit about, if you were creating the model you wanted to see and where this model goes, where is a place for that sort of trauma-informed approach?
I would say, as we're researching, one of the best programs that exist of this kind is in Eugene, Oregon, the CAHOOTS program. I think that's a program, and I bring that program up because in my understanding, it's been around since the 60s and 70s. And so I bring that up to say that I could be think I'm the smartest person in the world, but whatever we put out there is going to have to be flexible. It's going to have to be connected to communities that are most impacted and knowledgeable about the issues. And so to me, it's less about finding and dictating the perfect model as we begin, but being able to have a real flexible process to be able to adapt because also all our cities are different. The city of Phoenix is very sparse and it has very different neighborhoods. All that to say, there's principles I think we're going to set forth to make sure that this does the best job that it's meant to do. But I think part of the key point of it is going to be able to either accompany it with a community ad hoc committee or some sort of board that makes sure that this program is functioning the way it's intended to.
So studies of 911 call volume from other cities have suggested that somewhere between 30 and 70% of police calls for services could be handled without sending an armed officer to the scene. And those sorts of calls could be effectively addressed by community responders and administrative response, something that doesn't require a badge and a gun. So do you have any sense of what that number is in Phoenix, and how many calls are police responding to that might not actually need a response, a police response rather?
Yeah, so the only measure we have right now is mental health calls. And again, it's up to the officer's discretion to write it down as such. So we have about 24,000 of those a year. Now, having said that, we have not either trained officers or the 911 responders to adequately identify what a mental health call or a substance abuse call or some of these other calls can or should be. And so I think part of what we need to do in this first couple of years is gather real data. And so as we add new 911 responders that are going to have this new training, or as we train up the new calls, I think we'll be getting a better sense of how much of that lift that the current police department holds will be taking off their hands. So as of now, I could say comfortably, in the data that we have, is 24,000 mental health calls happen a year that this program will now respond to without an officer with a gun and a badge. But I suspect that those numbers are far greater. And as we start going into this program, we'll realize that those numbers are going to both take away from the police department, but also might need further investment than the 15 million we're allocating for it now.
Do you think that there could be a move to explore this sort of non-police response to other areas? I mean, one thing that I'm of course thinking about right now is traffic stops. Are there any other areas that you think these calls could, that we could have an alternative respond to those calls, and what are those areas?
Yeah, I think traffic is the number one, and it's the next conversation that folks are having. I think Berkeley, California is moving forward with that. One of the conversations we've been having and speaking about budgets and what's moving is, I think we all agree it's a broken system. It's a oppressive system that we've developed. But what happens year after year when we go through these budgets or go through our programs, we never have a reset point. We always add or try to shift or move things as they sit. And we're talking about programs that were developed during segregation, during the worst times of this country. And some would argue that today might be some of the worst times of this country. But we've had white male established programs, budgets for the entirety of this city's life. And so I feel like there's a point where we need to reestablish all that. There was budgets, police programs, and so on that were created under different times that I think we need to look at. And so I don't want to just say these calls or that calls, but I do think the entire system needs to be redone and figured out what it is that we're trying to accomplish with public safety, with policing, or these other programs. And so I think it's a broader conversation rather just say, traffic calls or mental health calls or drug calls, whatever calls. I do think there's coming a time across the country to reevaluate the function of police departments and how we handle these issues. And unfortunately, how we've handled, whether it's been drugs or whatever issues in this country, is by declaring war on them. And I think it's that mindset that we also need to shift in actually trying to solve these problems, not simply throwing more enforcement, guns, or declaring war on issues.
There is so much to respond to in everything that you just said, and I really want to get into all of it. One main thing I want to talk about is sort of you talk about how all of these institutions are essentially rooted in white supremacy. Those weren't your exact words, but that's what I'm hearing.
That's what I meant.
I got you. And I think it's interesting to see something like that as simple when it comes to the process of making a city's budget. And I think about too how that means the things that have been underinvested in are the things that serve Black and brown communities, the things that would have helped Baco and his mother. And so how do you change simply the way that a city council looks at a budget? Like, what sort of procedural changes do you make to root that sort of supremacist attitude out of it?
And that's, I mean, if I could answer that now, I'd probably not be doing the interview, but trying to implement as we speak or walking around this floor. But I do think it's starting with that question and asserting those truths. There was a time in Phoenix where there wasn't even districts, right? And the majority of the city council and the mayor all lived in one neighborhood. You can imagine that was the white side of town where the people with money lived. And those folks for many years decided where all the money, where our budget, and how the city would function. And we've yet to understand that that's problematic first, but we continue to try to kind of fix, put tape over, do whatever we can to try to make that better. But I think, and it's a conversation that's happening across the country. We're not the only ones happening. If the roots are not just tainted, but are rotten, and we understand that those roots are rotten, then I think it's important for us to kind of take everything out, do the soil and figure out what kind of world or what kind of functions we want our city government, and in this situation, the police to handle or not handle. And so I think that reset conversation is hopefully gonna start happening. But I'm sitting on a city council that before we got on council, I believe every single person that sat on the council had been endorsed by the police department. And so there's a long line of traditions of if the police did not support you, you couldn't sit in one of these seats. And understanding that, unpacking that, and how that's led to the contracts, the funding, and how we relate to police in this city.
So right now you're making this effort where, at the city level, but there's also an effort in Congress to create a new program in Health and Human Services that would provide somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion per year to support these types of programs in the same way that the DOJ and others fund traditional law enforcement now. So what do you see being the role of the federal government for the ability of cities, counties, and states to expand these programs? And have you had any conversations with members of Texas's congressional delegation or Arizona's delegation or others about what can be done to allocate funds for this?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would respond to that is, we just had the CARES Act funding last year, and we're starting to have conversations about the American Relief Act coming this year. And the reason I bring those up is because we had an opportunity. Again, I've been on council for a year and a half, but in the last, during the pandemic, the federal government came in. They did have some restrictions, but they were like, here's $75 million to figure out how to help community that is impacted by COVID in your city. It allowed us to dream. I never thought, coming into office that I would be able to think about food security, about Wi-Fi and tablets for young folks or elderly folks. And it allowed us to connect to community in a different way and actually meet a lot of the needs that this rotten budget I've been talking about never allowed us to. And so I feel like coming off of that experience, I would say, bring it on. like invest on how we do this differently and allow local governments who are having these conversations. And some places might not have the conversations we're having in others, but I think if those resources and a sentiment of trying to refigure out what policing looks like in this country um, is the way to go. Because I can assure you, if we get whatever that allocation from the number you gave from the federal government to the city, it will allow us to push to have that conversation, and to be able to fund programs like this one, but also maybe explore other things like traffic, like even reporting this year. We're in our budget, we're not adding more uniform police officers, but we are having to add budget from our general fund for reporting, for other kind of civilian uses. And what we're hearing back from community is like, no, don't even do that. We don't trust police. Why don't you figure out a place where, the reports that we need from police or the complaints that we need to give are actually living in other places? And so all that to say is I think it would be helpful. I have not had conversations with our federal reps. I think it's something we should be doing, and so I'll definitely follow up on that and try to figure out how we can get support from them.
Well, Councilmember, thank you so much for being with us today and for doing the good work that you're doing.
Thank you for having us, and again, I think we're all mourning what's happened the last couple of weeks, and I hope we can continue to work together, and thank you all for covering these issues.
Thank you. It has been a really difficult week, I think, for a lot of people in this country right now. And especially during this week, I have to say, as host of this show and as a Latina woman, that was a difficult story to hear on top of everything. But I think I think the council member was absolutely right that optimism is not the word that we should have right now when thinking about how to deal with the trauma of this week. It's urgency. It's worth noting again that Cousteau was killed 9 days after Michael, or I don't know if it was 9 days, but very shortly after Michael Brown was killed. And that police killings of people who they are supposed to protect have been happening throughout the history of this country for a very long time. And just as the council member said, the only way to be able to address that is to redo the roots of rotten soil. And part of the way to redo those roots is to take things away from police departments, things that they are not suited to handle. Right now, the council member mentioned 24,000 mental health calls that police officers do not need to be involved in. Those are lives that could be saved if they are not involved in those calls. And so as we think about how to cope with the brutality that police often cause in this country, specifically towards people with mental illness, towards people who are Black, towards people who are Latinx, we have to think about the need to simply take away power from police officers and give it to people who know how to help their communities. So that is all the time we have for today on the Appeal Live. Thank you so much for joining us, and you can continue to watch us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. Thanks again.